I knew I shouldn't have come home for Thanksgiving. As I looked at what remained of the bumper of my car in my aunt's driveway in the frosted moonlight of 4 a.m., half listening to the bleary explanations from my younger cousin on what happened to my car, I couldn't stop thinking about how I had almost stayed back in the city. My apartment would have been a little lonely, but my car would have been intact. The decision to come back to my tiny rural hometown in Pennsylvania had seemed reasonable at the time, as I had spent an exhausting month navigating the waters of an unexpected, messy breakup with someone I was supposed to spend the holidays with. A few days after I got here, feeling slightly less heartbroken, I realized what an idiot I was for not just enjoying the time to myself. I had been so scattered that I hadn't even remembered to pack socks, which my cold bare feet and the borrowed pair of my aunt's slippers reminded me of. To try to keep some semblance of warmth, I had my hands deep in the pockets of my frayed pajama pants, a pair I had left behind and forgotten about years ago that I had rediscovered in the back of a closet. When I realized I hadn't packed any, my cousin kept going on, walking a few steps towards me and then turning back to the mess. Even though it was obvious what had happened from the crumbled hole in the garage door and the corresponding crumbled hole in my bumper, I guessed he was trying to find an outlet for his guilt and nervous energy, and also there was a strong possibility he was trying to walk himself into sobering up. I thought I could make it to the store and back before anyone noticed. I didn't realize the brakes were that sensitive, and the garage, damn, it just came up so fast. He smelled like weed and some kind of sugary candy. He rambled on, his words a jumbled mix of apologies and excuses. Tyler had come to the door of the spare bedroom I always stayed in about half an hour before, looking a mixture of sheepish and panicked. Still dressed in his heavy parka, I had just fallen asleep after a restless few hours lying awake thinking about my ex, Casey, and whether or not it had been smart to end the relationship. Part of me still felt like this was just a stress-induced bad dream trying to work out my emotions, but it also was very in character for Tyler to mess up and for me to try to clean up after him. I took my hands out of my pockets to gesture to the mess, regretting it immediately as the cold bit my fingers. Tyler, you didn't hit anything, right? And how did you even get the keys? I asked, my voice somehow sounding even more exhausted than I felt. Did you go into my purse? He shrugged, avoiding my gaze and sounding defensive. No, of course not, and I found your keys where you left them on the kitchen table. I didn't think it'd be a big deal. We were supposed to go out anyway. His defensive answer made me snort with bitter laughter, given how big of a deal it had become, which set him off again with a spew of excuses and justifications for why he stole my car. I had begrudgingly agreed that I might drive him to Wawa earlier, but I had felt too jet-lagged and mopey when the time came, and told him I wasn't up for it. It seemed he found a way around that. As he rambled, my attention drifted to my aunt and uncle's house behind us. Its faded white paint was faintly blue in the low light, and it stood as silently as me in the chilly morning air. The patio was spilling over with garden decorations, sculpture supplies, and pieces of half-finished home improvement projects, some of which I recognized from years ago, and which were on a seemingly permanent hiatus. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows on the overgrown lawn, ankle-deep with leaves, almost as high as the field that bordered the property. An elaborate wind chime, one of Aunt Marley's art pieces, clanged against the window. I looked towards the bedroom on the second floor, wondering if my aunt would sleep through the increasingly heated pitch of my cousin freaking out. I sighed, my breath white smoke in the too early morning cold. This was precisely the kind of drama I had hoped to avoid by almost not coming, the kind that always seemed to cling to my hometown like gum under a table no one ever bothered to clean. My parents hadn't even stayed, retiring to Florida the same month I left for college. But here I was, freezing my butt off, staring at the wreckage that was once my reliable sedan. I was about to say something else when the front door creaked open. Aunt Marley stood there, wrapped in a thick pink bathrobe, her hair in a messy bun stuck through with a few chopsticks. What the hell is going on out here? Her voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet air. Her eyes found the mess, and her face went slack with shock before her jaw tightened in anger. Are you kidding me, Tyler? He seemed to shrink a foot in that instant, shriveling at his normally pathologically cheery mother's rebuke. I just looked at her and shrugged, shaking my head. She had known us both our whole lives, well enough to know who was the perpetrator and who was the victim. Aunt Marley sighed heavily, her gaze softening as she looked at the two of us, who must have looked obviously miserable, and me shivering in the cold. We'll talk about this in the morning. Come inside, both of you. It's freezing out here. Back in the warmth of the house, we didn't bother turning on the lights, all of us familiar enough with the low light of the nightlights dotted through the hallways. Still looking small and deflated from his mother's scolding, Tyler mumbled a half-hearted goodnight and quickly disappeared upstairs. Aunt Marley and I exchanged a look, a mix of frustration and understanding, before we headed to our respective rooms, the need for a couple more hours of sleep outweighing the need for further discussion. I slept fitfully, the image of my ruined car, lit by the flickering porch lamp like a strobe light in a haunted house, replaying in my mind like it had been branded there. In my dream, Tyler drove through the cornfield, laughing and churning up the dirt, coming closer and closer to where I stood, tied to a post and trapped in the middle of the field like a scarecrow. I woke up with a headache, a sinking feeling in my stomach, and a desperate need for coffee. I went to text Casey, only to remember that we had broken up and we had gone no contact on top of that. I really felt like venting to the world with a few woeful pictures, but last week, after the breakup, I had installed a 72-hour productivity blocker to stop me from doom scrolling Casey's socials. I didn't want to burden my friends with more miserable BS after leaning on them through the breakup, so I opted just to try to get over it on my own. Rubbing my temples, I shuffled out of the bedroom in my borrowed slippers and into the living room. It was cluttered with mismatched furniture, but cozy with paintings and photos crowding the walls. They mainly featured Aunt Marley's favorite mediums of delicate pastel florals and fairies, the signature style that made her a favorite at local craft fairs and farmers markets. I walked in front of one of my favorites that featured blue cornflowers and elves with toadstool hats, hoping it would lift my mood before I faced whatever gloominess was in store for the day after what happened last night. Aunt Marley's art was inspired by the old orchard that grew along the west side of their property. The fallow fields and ancient, gnarled apple trees were muses for her work. Knowing her and the house like I did, I could see them in the paintings, full of fluttering woodland spirits, apple blossoms, and sparkling cornflower-filled meadows. My aunt loved creating her very own fairy lore. She gave them personalities, vocations, likes and dislikes, and overall did really in-depth world building, like how the fairies would ride on the backs of dragonflies, or how they'd use dandelion fluff to make their beds. She would write her own literal fairy tales about sprites having little adventures in the orchard, helping lost baby animals, or bringing rain to dry patches. Her parenting style was an extension of her art. She always encouraged Tyler and me to use our imaginations to see the beauty in nature around us. We'd leave out offerings for the fairies, like bowls of milk, thimbles of honey, or tiny flower crowns Aunt Marley taught us to make. It was her way of teaching us to appreciate the world and look for magic in the everyday. The familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee hit me in a truly everyday magical fashion, and I beelined for the kitchen. Overhead, one of Uncle TJ's custom-made light fixtures, a spiky mesh of metal and colored glass, cast a floral light pattern across the room. He was an artist, too, a sculptor who specialized in welding found metals. Aunt Marley and Tyler were both already in the kitchen, quiet, but obviously stewing. "Good morning," I offered to the tensely silent room. I filled a chipped mug with coffee and went to the fridge. There was always a bag of edibles in the vegetable drawer, and I ripped a gummy in half and swallowed it whole, hoping it would relieve the throbbing headache in my temples. "Hi," Aunt Marley responded without turning around, immersed in Thanksgiving prep. The counter was a chaotic spread of ingredients, including what I recognized as tofurkey, and a towering hodgepodge of other ingredients, cutlery, and bowls. Tyler just grunted in acknowledgement, slouched over a bowl of cereal in front of him. He was slowly spooning it in, looking like he was still half asleep, his hair tousled, and his movements sluggish. The kitchen table was a large piece of reclaimed wood, surrounded by a quirky assortment of chairs, and I picked my favorite, a repurposed booth seat from an old diner. Tyler didn't make eye contact with me when I sat down, obviously embarrassed about what had happened the night before. I sipped on my coffee and looked out of the window. The garden was unusually overgrown and wild, scattered with an assortment of objects, garden gnomes peeking out from the tall grass, a few faded decorative stones, and metal sculptures half visible from under the leaves. Everything was winged by the old apple trees and backlit by an overcast, gray sky, the bright colors struggling under layers of dying foliage, and chaotic disarray of the normally well-kept garden reminded me of an abandoned theme park, like you could still hear the echoes of laughter and music from when it was better loved. Tyler and I grew up immersed in Aunt Marley's fairy lore. As kids, we'd spend hours exploring the yard, which was brimming with her fantastical influence, hoping to catch a glimpse of them. Aunt Marley still took her beliefs seriously. She would leave out small offerings, trinkets, little clothes, and bits of food, other bits and bobs as she saw fit to keep the fairies happy. As I looked out the kitchen window to the garden, at the end of a row of colorful glass bottles, I could see a tiny stone bowl filled with milk on the windowsill, just as it always had been, and a half-eaten shortbread cookie that some lucky critter had munched on. I felt like Tyler still half lived in that fantasy world. He'd started smoking pot and dabbling in drugs young, which wasn't unusual at all for our non-traditional family, but now he was doing it in enough excess to worry my aunt and uncle and me. It was like he was still chasing after those fairies, waiting for Peter Pan or his Hogwarts letter, or maybe he was using our magical childhood memories to drift away from the pull of an adulthood he didn't want to face. Tyler, about last night, Aunt Marley started, her voice firm but weary. He didn't look up from his cereal, but immediately answered, "Yeah, I know, I screwed up. It's more than that," Aunt Marley insisted, facing us and leaning against the kitchen counter. "You've been dodging chores ever since your dad left for the work trip. That ends now." Her sentences were halting in a way that made me curious, and I filed it away to talk to her about later. Tyler finally met her gaze, a mix of guilt and defiance in his eyes. "So, what's my sentence?" "The yard's a mess. It needs mowing, and that garden's a weed fest," she said, pointing toward the unkempt garden outside with an oven mitt-covered hand. "Your dad would be embarrassed to see it like this." "I know I am." He let out a long breath, pushing aside his bowl of cereal, which was now mostly mush. "Fine, I'll handle it. Anything else?" "The garage," she said, her tone hardening a bit. "You need to clean up that disaster. It's a mess, and it's on you to fix it." Tyler slumped his shoulders, but he nodded in agreement. "I'll clean it," he said. "My aunt wasn't done, and you're going to start helping around here more. Vacuuming, dusting, cooking, you're pitching in. No more dicking around." He hesitated momentarily, then nodded, and stood up, scraping the chair back with his foot and heading for the door. Aunt Marley watched Tyler for a moment, her expression a mix of frustration and concern, like she felt like she hadn't made her point yet. I wondered how many times they had similar conversations in the years it had been since I last saw them. "And one more thing," she added as Tyler stood to leave. "You're grounded. No going out with friends until all this is sorted out." Tyler stopped in his tracks, turning to face her. "Grounded? Are you serious?" His face was bemused and furious. Aunt Marley always had this sort of whimsical hippie way about her. For her to come down on him like this was unprecedented, at least as far as I could remember. "You can't ground me. I'm 18. His whine didn't have the effect he had been going for. "Yes, I can, because you are 18. And still living in my house rent-free, still in high school, and I am definitely still your mom," she replied firmly. He sighed heavily, a scowl crossing his face, but he didn't argue, either because he agreed or he was too angry to think of what to say. He grabbed his jacket off his chair and headed out the back door to start on the lawn. Aunt Marley suddenly jolted and ran after him, and I almost spilled my coffee, turning to watch her, wondering what would happen next. "Be careful with the tiny town. Just raking. Don't bring the mower near it." My aunt sounded frantic, and it took me a second to figure out what she was talking about. When I did, I smiled behind my hand, relieved and nostalgic. When we were kids, a near-perfect ring of tiny, white-capped mushrooms sprang up overnight one humid summer night, encircling an old stump in the backyard covered in moss and wildflowers. It looked absolutely enchanting, like something out of a storybook, and my aunt was utterly convinced it was a fairy circle. She had built these tiny, intricate houses and buildings from found objects on the spot, creating a miniature village at the base of the stump. It was her way of making the circle welcoming for the fairies, especially during the colder months, and the photographs and paintings she did of it were some of her most popular sales. "Do you hear me, Tyler?" she yelled into the yard. "Yes," he shouted back venomously, his voice sounding far away. "I'm not even starting back there. I'm in the garage." "Relax, Mom." As the door swung shut with a bang, Aunt Marley let out a weary sigh, sitting heavily next to me on the bench and letting her head rest against my shoulder. "Want some help?" I offered, putting my arm around her and giving her a squeeze. "All of the help, please," she answered. She glanced out the window at Tyler, who was furiously gathering supplies from the shed and bringing them to the garage, and shot me a weary look. "How about with getting ready for Thanksgiving?" I asked. "No, it's okay. You've had a long night, too. I'm so sorry, Alex. We'll pay to have it fixed." I had almost forgotten my car, and my stomach somersaulted when I thought about the work that would need to go into fixing it. "I know, it's okay." I tried to smile reassuringly, and she returned it weakly. She nodded, picking at a divot on the table. "Thank you. I just wish Tyler would understand things better." Her usually serene facade seemed cracked more deeply than my ruined bumper would entail. "What's he not getting, aside from, how to be an adult?" I asked half jokingly. Aunt Marley was quiet for a long minute and avoided the question entirely. She sat up straight and played with her apron ties. "He's a good kid, deep down," she said, more to herself than to me. "Just lost his way a bit." I nodded in agreement, although privately I thought, a bit. He literally stole a car last night. It made me wonder how else he had gotten lost in the time that we drifted apart. My goddess, the car, on top of the breakup. "I'm sorry again. I know you're still healing from that, but that Casey wasn't right for you at all. Not the right alignment." It was anyone's guess whether she was talking about planets, stars, numbers, or some other kind of mystical faded romanticism, as she loved it all. Still, I found it comforting that she was so confident that I had made the right decision. My parents had really liked Casey, which is part of the reason I had turned them down when they invited me to spend the holidays with them and the Keys. We both sat there in silence, sipping our coffee and listening to Tyler trudge back and forth around the house, hissing curses and slamming doors. When Aunt Marley finished her coffee, she sighed, setting down her empty cup. "Well, I better get started on the Thanksgiving prep." And I changed my mind. If you're feeling better, I wouldn't say no to an extra set of hands. I can never believe how hard it is to get everything together, even days in advance. I haven't even thought about the pies yet, and I wanted to get some drawing in today, too. I smiled. My headache had eased, and I had the beginnings of a relaxing buzz from the edible. "Sure, I'll help. That'll be nice to keep busy." As we worked into the afternoon, the tension and silence from earlier in the day dissipated, replaced by the comforting routine of meal prep and the warm buzz of being stoned. The rhythmic sound of the knife hitting the cutting board was soothing, and the kitchen filled with the warm, comforting scent of butter and spices. Aunt Marley shared little tips and tricks as we went along, and I found myself getting absorbed in the process, the earlier stress melting away. She was also an artist in the kitchen, knowing exactly what pieces went where until she reached for something in the fridge and came up empty. She hit her forehead with her palm, leaving a smear of white flour. "I think I'll have to run to the store," she finally said, setting down her kitchen towel. "Bleck, it's going to be a nightmare, but the veggie turkey will taste like a brick without rosemary, and mine didn't make it through that frost last week. It won't take long." She untied her apron and walked quickly to the door, grabbing her coat and a scarf. We were deep in rural Pennsylvania, and the nearest grocery store was almost a half hour away. "Are you sure? I can go," I offered, but she was already halfway out the door. Then I realized I couldn't. Aunt Marley saw my face and made a sympathetic wince, both of us remembering my car. "No, you stay and keep things going here. I'll be quick," she insisted. "Okay, but call me if you get tackled in the spice aisle, and I'll get an Uber." "It's going to be crazy," I joked as she headed towards the door. "I will. Love you," Aunt Marley called to me over her shoulder, blowing me a chain of air kisses as the door shut. With Aunt Marley gone, the house felt quieter, almost too big. I went back to chopping vegetables, but my attention kept drifting. My mind wandered to Casey and our last argument, and my stomach plummeted. I felt suddenly intensely lonely, and I had the munchies, too. I debated for a minute, then decided I was more sad and in need of company than angry, so I picked up my phone and texted my cousin, "Come in for a sandwich." I thought that was a nice enough peace offering, but I waited 10 minutes, and my cousin didn't respond. I started making lunch regardless, but caught sight of him through the kitchen window, walking in the backyard, dragging the old lawn mower. I tapped the window with the knife handle loud enough that he looked up at me and then looked away, putting on his headphones. I texted him again, just sending a few question marks to my earlier message. Through the window, I saw him look at his phone and put it back in his pocket, deliberately leaving me on red. A flash of irritation hit me, and I pounded at the window harder. He kept his head forward, avoiding looking at me. What a passive-aggressive little kid, I thought. I felt a sudden, urgent burst of white-hot anger. I banged on the window hard, feeling the glass shake under my hand. I knew it was stupid, and there was even a chance I might break it, but I was full of pent-up frustration that needed an outlet. My movement caught his attention, and Tyler turned his head to me, looking puzzled and annoyed by my frantic gesturing. As I watched him turn the mower around for another pass, something in the leaf pile he was heading towards caught my eye. It was a subtle movement, but enough to make me stop banging and try to point it out to him. He mistook the gesture for something more rude and flipped me off. In just a few seconds, he stumbled sharply, almost falling in front of the lawn mower. My heart stopped as I watched him fumble and finally regain his balance just before falling in front of the blades. There was a chittering wet sound of something hitting the metal, a sound that will always be permanently burned into my memory. Tyler stopped and stared at the ground, jaw hanging open. I bolted through the door, running to him. "Are you okay?" I gasped, out of breath from the sprint. Tyler didn't look at me, so I followed his eyes instead. I'm not exactly sure what happened next. I was stoned and distracted. I am sure I saw this. Tyler had inadvertently driven the mower right through Aunt Marley's beloved fairy circle, and half of the tiny village had been completely destroyed. Most of the carefully built houses, which I knew had taken hundreds, if not thousands, of hours for her to make, were now just piles of scattered bark, broken twigs, and crumpled leaves. The furniture pieces she had placed inside the houses, miniature chairs made from bent twigs, windows of beach glass, tiny tables crafted from bottle caps and acorns, and small beds from layered dried petals, were scattered, damaged, and in some cases totally obliterated. But there was something else, too, lying next to the mess, something living that looked like it had been mangled. The poor thing I had seen rustling in the leaves. When Tyler and I talked about it later, I said I thought it was a squirrel or a young possum. It was about the right size, but Tyler said he saw something else, something that had been twisted and mangled and gasped in pain, very much a living thing at the end of its life, but gushing blood that was a deep, black and green, something delicate that looked like it was made out of bark and twigs like Aunt Marley's houses, something that had colorful gossamer wings that had been reduced to crumpled tissue paper, something that had taken one last gurgling gasp and crumbled into the dirt like the decaying leaves around it. My attention, however, was entirely on Tyler. I still wasn't sure he hadn't caught himself in the mower and was checking for any visible injuries. I had glanced down briefly and saw something squeaking horribly before I averted my eyes, but by the time I looked again, there was nothing there, and I assumed whatever it had been had enough adrenaline to escape into the bushes. "Tyler, look at me. Are you okay?" I asked him, taking his shoulders and looking him in the eye. "Did you see that, Alex? Did you?" He spun around and then dropped to his knees, patting the ground. "Damn, what did I do?" he asked, looking up at me and then back at the ruined town, grasping at the shattered pieces. He repeated the phrase over and over again until I rested a hand on his back and guided him back inside. His lips were bloodless and his eyes were wide and wild. He just kept looking at his hands like he had taken an axe and cut it down on purpose and was looking for the evidence in his palms. I didn't know how to help him aside from reassuring him everything would be okay and that I would talk to Aunt Marley for him. I told him to just wait in his room until she got home and I would explain it to her. I did just that, swallowing the wave of pity I had when she walked into the kitchen, cheeks pink from the cold, and smiling. When I told her about it, she just fell apart. She didn't say a word, kept her raincoat on, and immediately walked through the backyard to assess the damage, slowly, like she was going to a funeral she didn't want to attend. I couldn't watch her after she got to the ruined art fixture she had worked so hard on, and I averted my eyes, but something caught my attention in the peripheral. The tiny stone bowl, which I could have sworn was filled with milk just that morning, was overflowing with something thick and red. It bubbled over the edges like a fountain. Maybe it was one of Uncle TJ's projects, or a Halloween decoration that hadn't been put away yet. I must not have noticed it, and the bowl I had seen was put away. I opened the window, curious, putting a finger in the stream. It was warm in a way that surprised and disgusted me. I took a napkin from the table and wiped it off, the tacky feeling of it clinging to my skin. Some of it was salvageable. Aunt Marley's voice surprised me, and I looked up. She had walked back towards me, her hands full of twigs and small pieces of cloth. "That's great," I exclaimed, injecting extra enthusiasm into my answer. but she didn't smile. Her wan face reminded me so much of Tyler's. She carefully placed the clump of what remained of her work on the ground next to a stone garden gnome that sneered like a pirate, complete with missing teeth. Uncle TJ and I have been having some problems. He stayed an extra week on that work trip, even with the holiday, Aunt Molly said offhandedly, dusting her hand on her jeans. I winced. I had wondered about my uncle's absence, which was not normal this time of year. Aunt Marley had said it was a commission he couldn't miss out on, but I couldn't help but wonder what kind of sculpture was so important that he would need to miss Thanksgiving. I don't think Tyler is taking it well, she continued, more out loud to herself than to me. Oh, Aunt Marley, it was an accident. No way he did it on purpose. I quickly reassured her. She gave me an exasperated look. I told him to use the rake, Alex. He shouldn't have been anywhere near there with the mower. I nodded slowly. It was a fair point. I distracted him, I offered, partially to try to assuage my own guilty feelings. She rolled her eyes, obviously unwilling to budge on excusing her son's behavior. We both looked at the horizon to the tree line. A few desiccated apples still littered the ground, and the wind carried over their sweet, spoiled smell. It'll be okay. You just gotta wait for that red alignment, I said, which made her smile thinly. True, she said, turning to come back inside. The rest of the night was quiet. Tyler never came back out of his room, and my aunt and I finished the cooking prep, ate a lackluster dinner of canned soup as we were too exhausted to do anything else, and went to bed early. I fell asleep abruptly, my body both physically and emotionally exhausted. My sleep was dreamless, and I probably would have slept straight through the night, but I woke up to Tyler again. This time, there was no knock on my door. He loomed over my bed, absolutely silent, his face pale and slack. Tyler, for a second, I thought it was a dream. I sat up, almost knocking into him. They're screaming, Tyler said matter-of-factly, looking vacantly at a place over my shoulder. What? Who is screaming? I pulled the covers further up my chest, feeling oddly defensive. Tyler didn't answer. Tyler, I asked again after a long silence. We have to. They won't let me sleep, he muttered, still not looking at me. I took a shaky breath and realized he must be sleepwalking. For what felt like the millionth time in my life, I felt like I had no idea how to help my cousin. I pulled out my phone and did a search for sleepwalking. Anxiety and exhaustion made it hard to read through the articles. I thought Tyler might wake up, his breath heaving with some unknown tension that made him wheeze, but he was statue still. I took his hand and tried to gently guide him back to bed like the wiki recommended. He let me pull him down the hallway, mumbling, before stopping dead in his tracks outside of his bedroom. The singing is so sad. Tears welled in his eyes, and he let out a sob. I didn't mean to, Alex. I'm so sorry. His eyes were still fixed somewhere behind me. Something creaked against the wall, and I looked over my shoulder, my heart slamming against my ribs. It was probably the house settling against the cold weather, but the darkness and his odd behavior made everything so much easier. I know, Tyler, it's okay. I tried to keep my voice calm. His eyes had gone unfocused and drifted to the spot behind me again. I held one hand on his arm and opened the door to his room. It was a typical teenager's mess, but it felt more chaotic than usual in the low light. Old soda cans, a couple of comic books, and fantasy novels, and what looked like a week's worth of schoolwork were all jumbled together. His laptop was open, its screensaver casting a faint, eerie glow in the semi-darkness. His bed was a tangle of sheets and a crumpled comforter like he'd been tossing around in it. I helped him sit in it, trying to control his fall the best I could as he outweighed me by at least 50 pounds. He curled up in an almost fetal position, facing the wall. They say they'll never let me sleep again, he whispered. I stared at the back of his head for a minute before leaning over to check his face. His eyes were still wide open and looking blankly at the wall, but he seemed calm enough. I deliberated on what to do next. I considered getting my aunt, but after the incredible stress of the last 24 hours coupled with my exhaustion, I eventually decided to just go back to my room and let him sleep off whatever was happening with him. I wish I hadn't left him. When I went back to bed, this time, I dreamed I was the one driving my car and Tyler stood in the middle of the field, crying and begging me to stop. There was a high-pitched keening, as if it could somehow be made of voices. I tasted the metallic tang of blood and spoiled apples. It was a relief to wake up, for a few minutes, anyway. Jesus Christ. My aunt's voice, coming from somewhere deep in the house, was loud enough to carry all the way to the second floor. I had been scrolling aimlessly on my phone, listening to the soft patter of rain outside. I sprinted from my room, taking the stairs 2 at a time to make my way to the kitchen. My aunt stood at the sink, scrubbing her hands viciously like she had touched something poisonous. "What happened?" I asked, my eyes darting around the room. They found the counter and I felt my jaw drop. The food we had made yesterday was a putrefied mess. The tin foil was pulled back from the bowl I had filled yesterday, and the vegetables that had been fresh less than 24 hours ago had wilted into a mushy, unrecognizable heap, oozing a dark, sticky liquid that pooled around their container. The rolls, stacked neatly in a basket, were now covered in a crawling green mold, their texture like sponges. The pies were out, too, and even without taking the plastic wrap off, I could see that something was wiggling around in at least 2 of them, tiny white maggots struggling to make their way out of their containment. Even the air in the room felt damp with the stench of rot. I pulled my shirt over my mouth and nose, holding it tightly. I honestly don't. I think we must have lost power last night during the storm. The lights were flickering this morning, too. My aunt was still scrubbing her hands. She sounded bewildered and defeated. I stared at the mess for another minute before finally taking action, grabbing a garbage bag from a cabinet and tossing out the putrid food. It was so foul that I wished I had rubber gloves. I could understand why Aunt Marley was still scrubbing her palms raw at the sink. I struggled with the bag's weight, sliding it to the back door. Through the window at the top of the door, haunted eyes stared back at me. I reared back, opening my mouth to scream, only to realize it was Tyler. His face was sopping wet from the rain. Maybe he had been out doing his list of chores and came when he heard his mother scream, or he had been watching us from outside. "What the hell, Tyler?" I demanded. He stood in the doorway, dripping onto the linoleum. I shoved the trash bag into his hand. "Can you take this out, please?" My voice made it clear it was more of a demand than a request. His arm raised to take it automatically, but his face gave no indication that he understood me. He was staring at his mother, who had turned off the water, but still stood hunched over the sink. "Now, Tyler," I pushed at his chest, only to grasp at his shirt when it seemed he was going to let me knock him over altogether. That seemed to jostle him enough to get him moving, and he turned towards the garage. Watching him leave, I realized he wasn't wearing his coat or shoes despite the frigid rain. I almost called him back, but by the time I processed what I had seen, he had already turned the corner and was out of sight. "Aunt Marley," I started to speak, but I didn't know where to start. "I'm going to go to the store," she said firmly. "We need food for Thanksgiving." Okay, sure, but I tried to interject. I needed to tell her about Tyler. "I'll be gone for a few hours." Her voice was trembling with emotion, and her hands were shaking, too. I guessed she had hit her limit. I bit my lip, debating whether to mention Tyler's bizarre behavior. I decided it could wait until she got back. "All right, take your time and drive safe," I said. She walked past me to the front door, and I took her spot at the sink, vigorously washing my hands. By the time I finished, my hands were red and raw, and she was gone. I walked through the whole house looking for Tyler, including the basement, with no luck. I walked back to the kitchen, gazing out at the half-mowed lawn, and something flashed red in the corner of my eye. I paused and looked out the window. Tyler was still outside in the rain, sitting on the stoop of the back door with his face in his hands. I immediately walked to the door and pulled it open. "What are you doing? Come inside. It's horrible out here." He stayed where he sat, hunched over. His beanie was plastered to his head, the only covering he wore besides an old t-shirt and boxers. Dirt caked his leg to the knee. I grabbed his shoulder hard. "Tyler, come on," I pleaded. At this point, I knew something was seriously wrong, like he was having some sort of breakdown, and my voice reflected that. He got up slowly, like it hurt to move, and slumped down on the kitchen floor. His hat slid off, and I was horrified to see rivulets of blood running down his neck. His right earlobe looked like someone had tried to pierce it in the dark. "What happened to your ear?" I handed him a paper towel roll that he made no move to accept. He mumbled something into his chest. "What did you say?" I crouched down, trying to avoid the puddles of dirty water mixed with blood he left in his wake. I took his hand and was shocked at how cold it was. How long had he been out there in only his underwear? "It's the fairies." His voice was barely a whisper. "What do you mean the fairies? Do you need to go to the hospital?" I wondered if it was slang for something like PCP, or if he was just straight up hallucinating altogether. "It was an accident. You saw that, right?" he asked me, eyes wide and wet with tears, looking 10 years younger. "The car, or the little village in the yard?" I asked. He looked like he might throw up. The fairy, he sobbed. He broke down, finally telling me what he had seen the day before, the creature that he swore he had seen die. I argued back that it was sad that he had hit an animal, and totally normal if he felt guilty, but he was adamant it was something else. The absurdity of it shocked me into silence, as we stared at each other, him miserable, and me incredulous. I think you had a really bad nightmare. Tyler, did you sleep at all last night? I finally asked him. He shook his head. A dribble of blood ran down his cheek, and I held a paper towel to it since it seemed like he genuinely wasn't capable of doing it. I wondered if he had taken something that made him pick at his skin, or if he had cut himself somehow yesterday. When he tripped, there was a guilty pang in my stomach. I felt like we were kids again, and I hadn't been watching him when I was babysitting. No, they said that I took a life that didn't belong to me, and I need to make it right. The misery in his voice made a chill go down my spine. We're talking about fairies, like Aunt Marley's fairies, like when we were little. I wondered if I was inadvertently encouraging him. He shook his head. They don't look like that. He pointed at one of Aunt Marley's paintings, behind me, that like pink and smiling. They look like, I don't know, like wooden dolls with joints that bend the wrong way, with sharp teeth. Wooden dolls, maybe some manifestation of his guilt for ruining the tiny town. How are you supposed to make it right, then? I asked, trying to keep my voice even. My mind raced. I felt completely inept. I couldn't wait for Aunt Marley to come home so I could unload the bizarre responsibility of navigating my cousin's nervous breakdown. I don't know yet. He considered the question, cocking his head. It's hard to understand them. It took me all night to make it out. They sound like cicadas, I guess. They chirp and hiss, but you can make out the words if you listen long enough. And one of them, what, like bit you? I gestured to his ear. He shook his head, his chin deep in his chest. No, it felt more like ... like they were putting their hands in my ears, scraping around inside my head. He reached up to touch the ear that bled. I shook my head and ran my hands through my hair, immediately regretting it as I realized how filthy I had gotten. Why don't you go clean up? I stood, trying to avoid the topic of fairy brain stabbing altogether. For a second, I wondered if I would have to hold his hand like I had the night before, but he pulled himself up, still dripping onto the floor, and made his way out of the kitchen. I grabbed more paper towels and wiped up the puddle on the kitchen floor. I took a shower after that, feeling like I had rolled around in a hospital dumpster. After, I just sat on my bed and lost track of time, doing a series of internet searches that made me feel increasingly more insane with each one. Side effects overdose, seeing fairies, fairy revenge myths, and legends. What to do when someone sees fairies' mental illness. I felt a wave of relief at the sound of my aunt's car in the driveway, pulling myself away from where I had hunched over my phone screen. I walked quickly down the stairs to the front door, opening it to meet her. My aunt was standing in the driveway next to her old pickup, grocery bags dropped to the ground. Her hood had slid off, and rain poured down her face, but she didn't seem to notice. She was staring at the garage door. It looked like someone had taken my car and rammed it 10 more times. The door was battered and bent, its panels warped and twisted in a way that made it almost unrecognizable, like scrapped tinfoil. The bumper of my car lay detached entirely, a few feet away from where it should have been. Scratches marred its surface, and streaks of paint from the garage door were scraped across it. The edges were jagged where it had been ripped from the car, and fragments of plastic and bits of headlight glass were scattered around it. Glinting in the light, the garage door and bumper were coated in a green and brown sludgy mess. Rotten food had been crushed and smeared on it. The remnants of our spoiled Thanksgiving were a viscous, unrecognizable paste that clung to the metal. Beneath the bumper, a trash bag, shredded and flattened, lay sprawled on the driveway. What's wrong with you? Seriously, what's wrong with you? Her eyes were bright and wild. I turned to see Tyler had come to stand behind me in the doorway, this time fully clothed, and his hair still damp from the shower. His eyes matched hers, bright, wild, confused. I didn't do that, he said, his face crestfallen. I swear I didn't. I taped up the bumper yesterday and swept up the glass. My aunt moved quickly, slipping a little on the wet ground, walking up to us like she was ready to do battle. She grabbed Tyler, pulling him from behind me into the garage. Aunt Marley, wait, I tried to intervene. Everything was happening so quickly. She pulled Tyler outside toward the mess of metal and spoiled food. Then she pushed him through the torn gap in the garage door. Don't come out until you fix it. Stay in there through Thanksgiving. I don't care. Just fix it, she hissed through her teeth. Tyler held his head in his hands. I didn't do this, Mom, I swear. Aunt Marley, I tried again. I think, just fix it, Tyler. My aunt's voice was steel. She grabbed the damp grocery bags and shoved past me into the house. Tyler started quietly crying in the garage, limbed by the sheets of rain that continued to fall. I stayed in the doorway, not knowing what to do next. I was torn between wanting to comfort my cousin and wanting to punch him in the face. Had Tyler been so mad that he was deliberately messing with us? Was he just messing with me for the past couple of days? Was he telling me lies with the fairy stuff? And worse, had I bought it that easily? As I contemplated, I looked out onto the field next to the house, watching the grass sway. I squinted my eyes, catching something moving in the distance. Long pieces of what looked like duct tape were braided through the edge of the field. They blew in the wind like ribbons. I wondered how they could have gotten so far away from the driveway. I shook my head and turned around. I had to talk to my aunt. I found her slumped in the worn plaid armchair in the living room, grocery bags still at her feet. I desperately wanted to give her some privacy, but I couldn't wait any longer. I cleared my throat, and she looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. Tyler's been. I cleared my throat again. He's been seeing things. He told me this morning that he did. Anyway, he's been acting really weird since yesterday. She blinked, trying to process what I was saying. What do you mean? What has he been seeing? Well, little creatures. She stared at me, waiting for me to continue. Fairies, I continued haltingly. If anyone would believe it, it would be her. She continued to stare at me, her face showing no reaction. Is this a joke? She asked. I'm really not in the mood, Alex. No, it's not a joke. I mean, I don't think he was joking. I think you might be sick. I explained some of the other odd things I had seen Tyler do over the past 2 days. Aunt Marley reached to the end table next to her and picked up one of her sculptures, a little pixie sitting on a toadstool. She cradled the sculpture in her lap and looked down at it. Fairies, that's a little coincidental, don't you think? She stroked the carved hair and crown with her thumb. Kind of feels like just another dig at me, using something I love to hurt me. He's been doing stuff like this so much lately, acting out since TJ left. The faraway look in my aunt's eyes made me wonder at the extent of what he had done to make my resilient, whimsical aunt look like she had just come back from war. What kind of person is he? She asked, her voice small and vulnerable. I was silent at that. I didn't feel like I knew Tyler well enough to know the answer anymore. It's just a bad week, Aunt Marley. I tried to reassure her. I picked up one of the grocery bags. I don't know about you, but I'm starving, I said. That was the wrong choice of words. I'm sorry, Alex. I haven't fed you at all this week, she said, her eyes welling with tears. She usually kept the house full of comfort food and baked goods. It's okay. You can have your chance now, I said, trying to lighten the mood. My aunt gave me a watery smile. It felt surreal to cook with her again, like we had been transported back in time to the day before. The grocery store didn't have all the same ingredients, as it had been cleared out by last-minute Thanksgiving shoppers, but it was enough to put together a nice enough meal. Aunt Marley calmed down as she cooked, enough so that I felt comfortable making a suggestion. Maybe we could bring a plate to Tyler, I asked tentatively. My aunt sighed and gave a tired half smile, which encouraged me to go on. See what he's up to with the power tools, I joked. We had heard the telltale buzzing of my uncle's saw about an hour earlier and had given each other a sideways glance. Whatever he was up to, at least he was trying. Yeah, I think we could do that, she answered. Would you mind bringing it in? I'm not ready to talk to him yet. I get that. Sure, I said. I could understand why she was simmering, but I also had this twisting feeling in my stomach that made me want to check on him. I couldn't quite believe it had all been an act. The gouged ear, especially. He was immature, but he wasn't that evil or desperate for attention. At least, I hope he wasn't. I borrowed my uncle's raincoat that hung unused in the hallway, shielding the plate of food as I made my way out to the garage. As rain pelted me, I wished for the 1000th time that the garage wasn't detached from the house I had taken many a frosty trip to bring my uncle food in his workshop. Tyler had put a tarp over the hole, and the mess that had once been the rotted food was melting in the rain, dripping down the driveway. I looked at my poor, mangled car and debated whether to just go back inside and let my cousin stay hungry on Thanksgiving. I sighed and pushed open the tarp, balancing the plate in one hand. All right, I opened my mouth to greet Tyler. It stayed open, jaw dropped, the words dying before I could speak. The lawnmower was disassembled entirely, its components broken and tossed into a heap. It had been reduced to pieces, and so had my cousin. Deep, jagged cuts covered his arms and legs, where the blade had carved through his limbs. Blood had soaked through his sweatpants and onto the garage concrete floor in such quantities it had started dripping into the sump pump. His hands were shaking, holding blades larger than I had ever seen. The blades from the mower. I understand them now. His lips had been cut, and he had trouble forming the words. It had to be an even trade. Blood dripped down his chin, making the words sound choked. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him, from his face, the places where it sagged, where the chunks of skin fell to the floor. My ears started ringing, a high-pitched, stuttering drone as my body flooded with shock. Tyler said something else I couldn't hear through the white noise of terror. He fell to his knees, and then onto his stomach, his head hitting the ground hard enough to make it bounce. I dropped the plate, the shatter echoing behind me as I ran back inside for my aunt. I don't remember what I said to her, but whatever it was made her immediately call 911 and shove the phone in my hand. Before she ran to see her son, before she started screaming, I ran out after them, my heart beating so hard I felt it in my fingertips. I dimly remember helping my aunt get my cousin into her truck, and her panicked tone when she tell the emergency operator to have the ambulance meet them halfway. We were so far away from the hospital that every second counted. I stayed on the phone with the 911 operator, numbly explaining the backwoods route, waiting until they finally confirmed the ambulance and police escort had spotted the truck and brought my cousin and my aunt to the hospital. The stupid productivity blocker on my phone finally ended. I couldn't care less about whatever Casey is doing on social media. I tried calling and texting Uncle TJ, but he hasn't answered. I don't even know where to start with explaining to my friends. I'm alone. I can't go anywhere without my car, and there aren't any ride services taking calls this far out because of the storm. I'm sitting in the living room on the couch, an Afghan wrapped tightly around me, wondering if I'm going crazy. I took a shower, but I still feel Tyler's dried blood under my nails. And I feel so stupid because it's all probably just in his head. In my head now, but I still filled up all the glasses in the house with milk and left them outside. I put all of the new Thanksgiving food on the doorsteps and windowsills, covering them with bowls of potatoes and plates upon plates of vegetables and pies. I dumped honey out in sticky trails until the bottles were empty. I sprinkled salt everywhere, even though it melted in the rain, because in some of the folklore, they say salt helps. Because when I think back on what Tyler said last to me before he collapsed, I think I remember it. A bloody, choked burble of words. They say it was your fault. I'm surrounded by my aunt's art of fairies laughing and smiling, dancing in rainbows and basking in the sun. But in the corners of my eyes, I see their grinning faces twisting and sharpening. I see their bodies splinter with jagged wood and claws. My childhood memories feel like they're mocking me. Outside, in the real world, I know it's bitterly cold and storm dark. I can hear the creaking branches of the apple trees and the whispering moans of wind blowing through the field, the sound both musical and melancholy. I can imagine what the world outside me looks like, although I'm trying not to, because my mind conjures up 1,000 pairs of eyes staring back at me through the grass, tiny bodies crawling up the side of the house, scratching at the walls and singing their locust songs. I can't make myself look out the window again to check, because the milk is turning red.